Hello everyone, and welcome to our podcast series in the classical political economy tradition by the Vinson Center for the Public Understanding of Economics and Entrepreneurship at the University of Buckingham. The Vinson Center runs a series of programs in economics and related fields designed to promote a wider understanding of classical liberal economics and how markets, trade and entrepreneurship promote welfare in a free society. I am Juan Castaneda, Director of the Vinson Center, and today we'll be hosting James Tooley. James Tooley is the Vice Chancellor of the University of Buckingham since October 2020, where he's also Professor of Educational Entrepreneurship and Policy. For 2 decades, he was Professor of Education at Newcastle University. He was previously an academic at the Universities of Oxford and Manchester. He has published extensively on education and educational policy. His book, based on his research, The Beautiful Tree, A Personal Journey into How the World's Poorest Are Educating Themselves, was a bestseller in India and won the Sir Anthony Fisher Memorial Prize. James has fostered entrepreneurial projects in education in the developing world. He has co-founded chains of low-cost schools in Ghana, Omega Schools, in India, Cadmus Education, and in Honduras, Cadmus Academies, and most recently in England, the Independent Grammar Schools. Today, we'll discuss education without the state with Professor James Tooley. James, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's really
the
good
topic
to be
of our podcast today is education without the state. The title of the book you authored for the Institute of Economic Affairs back in 1996, if I'm right. Quite often we hear that the state must intervene in education, that without the state there would be a vacuum or no provision of education for the poorest in society. What did you discover in your journeys in India, China, and several African countries about the provision of education by the private sector?
Yeah, and that's the really important point that you said, that we know that the private sector in education, everyone knows the private sector in education can serve the elite, the privileged, even the upper middle classes. Everyone knows that. The question is, if I'm talking about education without the state, we are worried about the poorest in society. How are they going to cope? And as you say, before my research over this last quarter of a century, people thought without the state, there'll be no provision for the poor. The poor will suffer, and therefore that's an argument against a sort of libertarian, classical liberal view on the role of government in education. And I guess I held that view, 20 or 25 odd years ago. And it was really, I went into the slums of the Old City of Hyderabad. This is where it first happened for me. And I did have a hunch about what I might find, mind you, and we can talk about why that was. But I went into the slums of the Old City and found a private school, a low-cost private school serving poor families in the slums of the Old City. And I found another, and was soon connected to a federation of these low-cost private schools, 500 of them. And then I managed to get a decent grant from the John Templeton Foundation and went looking for the same phenomenon in really the poorest slums in the world, really, in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Kenya, different parts of India, as well as rural China. And then after that was all summarised in my book, The Beautiful Tree. And then after that, I then looked at most difficult places, war-torn countries or conflict-affected states in Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia, South Sudan, Somalia. And in all these places, in all the urban environments I looked at, the same phenomenon. The majority of kids, 65, 75, 85% in one of the largest studies, the majority of kids in private schools, the private schools affordable by parents on the poverty line, the children in the private schools outperforming those in the government schools. Not surprisingly, parents are paying fees for their children. The schools are fair to girls. And the most important thing, this is a sustainable solution. So not only is it serving the poor at scale, the majority of kids are in these schools, but it's sustainable because these schools are run as small businesses, typically. Not dependent on handouts from anyone, no subsidy from anyone, funded in the main by parent fees. So what an extraordinary phenomenon to find in the poorest slums in the world, as a sustainable, scalable solution to education for all. It's been quite a trip.
Quite a discovery.
Yes.
And
it was a discovery for me, obviously, and for the West, if you like. Obviously, it was not a discovery for people in those communities themselves.
they were doing it.
They were doing it. But definitely, it was a discovery in that no one had pointed to this phenomenon before.
And something very important, James. It was low cost, truly low cost.
Yes.
So how affordable they were? I mean, you compare the level of income of some families to the amount of money they pay for education. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Very important. So these schools are low cost, and let's not be afraid of that term. Typically nowadays, you'd be able to send a child to a school like this for about £100 a year, maybe $150 a year, something like $130 a year. That would be a sort of typical amount. But we did in the end define what we meant by low cost. And it was that if you're a family on the internationally accepted poverty line, if you're a family on that line and you can pay 10% of your total income, 10% of your total income for the fees of all your children of school age, that is what we defined as a low cost private school, the school that you could afford to send your child to. Okay, if you're poor, 10% of your income sending all your children to that school, that's low cost. Okay, now obviously you have ultra low cost, you can have higher, and there's a whole continuum of fees, but these schools are genuinely affordable to the poor. That's the very important thing to stress.
Truly extraordinary.
Yeah, and while we're on that, I mean, it's people say it can't be pro-poor if the poor have to pay fees. Well, first of all, they prefer to pay fees and have the schools accountable to them. But secondly, sending your child to government school is not free. Very important. If you're poor, we've done lots of work on this, household surveys in different countries. Typically, it was something like this. The cost to a poor parent of sending their child to a government school was about 75% of the cost of sending to a low-cost private school. Why is it so high? Because of the other costs of education. Clearly the fees in the private school are higher than the government school, though there are some levies, building levies, some sort of cheek levies going on. But you have to buy shoes, you have to buy uniform, you have to buy books, you have to pay for transport. Typically the government schools are further away than the private schools. All the other costs make that differential. Yes, it is different, it's still 1.3 times more, but nonetheless it's not as different as you'd expect, and I think you were surprised when I gave you that figure. Yeah,
I was, and the quality of education was so much better for that extra.
So much better and more hours in the day. Yes, if you did it, how many hours per day you get, then the private schools are probably competitive. Probably equal. But I haven't got that figure in my head. Yeah.
So in that book that you just mentioned, published in 2009, The Beautiful Tree, A Personal Journey into How the World's Poorest People Are Educating Themselves, you show how low-cost private schools can be successful and deliver better standards for the poorest. If there is a market for it, and clearly there was a market for it in those countries you visited, why do you think there are not more low-cost private schools in most developed countries?
Yeah, in the developed world. And this is very, very interesting. And it was also true, and this is interesting to throw into the argument, it was also true that as you came down into South Africa, there were fewer of these low-cost private schools than, as it were, in West, East, Central Africa, and there's also in North Africa fewer of them. So there does seem to be a relationship between greater wealth. Perhaps the government schools, public schools as they call them in the rest of the world, the government schools are not as bad as they are in Nigeria or Kenya or Sierra Leone. That's one possibility. But your question is more specific about America and England and so on.
Yes.
And it is something that exercised me for a long time, particularly because I would, come back from my travels, dirty and tired from the travels, and give a talk at a conference in America or England, and people would say, so why isn't it here? If it's so good, why isn't it here? And I did have a sense that perhaps welfarism is so strong here. In the countries I worked in, people don't trust the state for anything. The state is seen as the enemy of the people, the obstacle to the people. Those are words that I've heard used by school proprietors. Here, there's this, there's what welfareism, or even sort of even more benign, just a sense, well, government is pretty much on our side.
It's embedded in the system.
It's embedded in us. We've had 150 years of not totally unsuccessful state schooling in this country, for example, 153 years since 1870. So, perhaps it was that. Perhaps I had sort of 7 or 8 theoretical reasons why perhaps there was nothing like it here. The regulations are probably too strong. Anyway, for a while I couldn't travel. And I was at Newcastle University for various reasons that I couldn't travel. And being just, at that time especially, just a one-trick pony, I went out onto the, as it were, the back streets of Newcastle with my clipboard, asking parents, do you want to send your child to private school? Yes. Why don't you send your child to private school? Duh, I can't afford it. How much could you afford? And I went through it, and I found there was quite a sort of a cohort of people who could have perhaps afford £50-60 a week over 52 weeks, and so I did set up a school up north. I was at Newcastle University, so we set up the Independent Grammar School with some business partners there. Independent Grammar School Durham, and the long and the short of it is we have. Now, the school's been running 4 years. Obviously, as Vice-Chancellor, I haven't been intimately involved for the last 2 or 3 years. But nonetheless, the school has now made a profit. It's full. It is shown that for £3,500 a year, not as low cost as the schools I'm describing there, but still that's 3/5 of the per capita funding in the state schools.
Well, James, it's low cost for the standard of living in this country, isn't it?
And it's a fifth of the average cost in the cost of the average private school. So it's very low cost. So we've shown that it can work. Now, even more exciting. Wait till you hear this. I was invited to give a talk at a conference in Atlanta earlier this year, and Atlanta, Georgia, and I've been reluctant to go to America for some time because I've not been that excited about sort of vouchers and the sort of the top-down initiatives that I thought Americans were obsessed with. Anyway, this conference was a conference called Hybrid Schools, celebrating hybrid schools and micro schools. These are low-cost private schools by another name. These are a lot of it came out of the COVID lockdowns, where a lot of parents saw how they realised the public schooling in America, the government schooling, was not suitable for their children. The curriculum they didn't like, the teaching methods, maybe even the time everything took. They didn't like all this stuff, so they've created what you could call homeschooling co-ops, homeschooling academy, hybrid schools, but morphing into micro schools, which just means small private schools. And I'm very excited that the movement that I've seen in the rest of the world is now coming to America, and by extension I'm sure it's happening here, a similar state. Low-cost private schools by another name, but a rose will smell as sweet by any other name. These are booming. Now, not to the extent they are in Nigeria, in Ghana and Kenya yet, but if these take off, I think we should watch this space. And in fact, I've got a new book brewing in my mind called The Beautiful Tree in America, and I'm hoping to be able to write that over the next year or two.
We're looking forward to the book. Yeah. So that's something you just mentioned I wanted to discuss a little bit on is, do you think that the state, the government, should have any role in setting up the school's curriculum? Or should it be just left to the schools to decide?
Well, so in terms of my philosophical position is very clear, and I've written several books about this sort of theme. Government should have no role in these things at all. But basically, the basic principle is education is intimately connected to the view of the good life, human flourishing. The two are very closely connected. And of course, the good life, what the good life consists of in a liberal state, should not be a matter for a state to say this is what the good life should be. It's a contested matter and we should allow us to try and explore different options for what the good life and human flourishing is. That's what a liberal state is about. Liberal in the old-fashioned sense.
Classical liberal.
Classical liberal, and education should be the same. Education is also, in my view, essentially contested, and there's no reason why that shouldn't be the case. And so, inevitably, we have different ideas of what should constitute education, and therefore, again, just as we don't allow government to intervene in what the vision of the good life should be like, we shouldn't allow government to intervene there. Now, one of my disappointments, and it's always worth mentioning the disappointments as well as the thrills and the excitement one gets. One of my disappointments globally has been that the only show in town as far as a poor parent is concerned is the national curriculum, the state curriculum, the state exams in India, Ghana, Nigeria, whatever. It's the only show in town. So poor parents are keen that the low-cost private schools that they're going to, they're keen that they do follow that sort of curriculum and so on. And now they typically experiment around it. For example, the curriculum is very sort of keen on giving lots of subjects quite early on, whereas parents say, well, let's get English and mathematics sorted out first.
The fundamentals.
The fundamentals. Yeah. And once those, you can do other things. So more time in the private schools is spent on English and mathematics than it would be under the state curriculum. But nonetheless, the eventual exams are typically the ones given by state. So that there's an innovation, and there's a possibility for an entrepreneur to come in there. I wrote about it in a book called The Really, Really Good Schools, just published 2 years ago by the Independent Institute. I have a couple of chapters on this. There's a real opportunity for an entrepreneur to step in here and create something different. I one time I called it IB Light, the International Baccalaureate Light, a low-cost equivalent to a really top curriculum that could be there for use in the low-cost schools and satisfy parents that they're not getting a second best, they're not being experimented on.
But that was, sorry, James, that was precisely the point that I wanted to discuss with you before, which is the room for improvement. I believe we all agree that it's massive in education.
Yes.
And yet it's happening, but it's not happening at the pace that one would expect.
No. Well, because government has taken this over, for 150, so in 1870, now this is, I mentioned earlier, I had a hunch about what I might find when I went to the slums of the Old City of Hyderabad. I had that hunch because of reading E.G. West, Professor Edwin George West, who is actually my mentor and hero actually, but he looked at the history of education without the state in England and Wales, and then later I think in Massachusetts and New York and also New South Wales and so on, and showed that, let's take the English example, England and Wales, before the state got involved in 1870, 95% of kids were in school for an average of 6 years, these are approximate figures, and they were in schools provided by church, yes, everyone knew that, synagogue, philanthropy, but also a substantial number of those schools were what I call now low-cost private schools. I think they were even called for-profit private schools in the Newcastle Commission report. But anyway, schools set up by entrepreneurs to cater for demand, and the demand was there. So that was before the state got involved. The state then comes in 1870, and then for the next 10, 20, 30 years, deliberately stamps out all that private spontaneous order provision, stamps it all out, starts saying the only proper schools are board schools, as they were called then, and then whatever they became state schools. So for 150 years, the state has been saying, we are the ones who know about education, you don't know anything about education, we're the ones who know. And is it any wonder, that sort of brainwashing has an impact. If it didn't have an impact, then you could never have authoritarian states, could you? Of course it's successful.
So we can put it very clear that before 1870 there was no vacuum as regards the provision of education in the UK without the state.
No,
it was already provided for the vast majority of the population.
Now there were some small subsidies from 1833, so it's not completely so prior to 1833. No, there's some wonderful quotes from John Stuart Mill, James Mill, from others, saying as far as the quantity of provision is concerned, it's all, the masses are all or about to be, suitably provided for. The quality they were worried about, and it's the same arguments about unqualified teachers, classrooms are not, the same sort of criticism we hear today about the low-cost private schools in developing countries. The people were making about these low-cost private schools in Victorian England. But no, I mean, the wonderful phrase that E.G. West came up with was the state jumped into the saddle of a horse that was already galloping. It's a wonderful phrase.
Metaphor.
But and then of course slowed it down, and then disabled the whole process. So that was why I went looking for the schools in the slums of India, Africa, and they are there, and there's, as you say, there's no vacuum. Education arises as a spontaneous order, because my line is, it's as natural for a poor parent to want to educate their child as it is to want to feed and clothe and house them. It's just the same impulse.
I keep on referring to this no vacuum or vacuum argument, as the state supporters put it, because they use the same argument to justify government intervention in many other areas in our lives.
Yes.
But you made it very clear, even before the state started the provision of education to the population, there was a market, a thriving market, at least in the UK.
Yes.
So there was no need, because usually it is said that externalities in education very much justify the government intervening and providing to the public.
Yeah. No, a very interesting point here you should know, and your listeners should know, is that Milton Friedman, famously in his 1955 essay, The Role of Government Education, he came out in favour of vouchers precisely for the externalities argument. You're saying that actually we need an educated society for a democracy, and without the state it won't be provided for everyone. He then read, or he got in touch with E.G. West. I think E.G. West was at Chicago briefly. Anyway, they were at the Mont Pelerin Society meetings early on, and Milton Friedman changed his mind. He actually wrote this in one of his books, that he has now been convinced that the externalities argument does not hold, because he has seen in historically, and he would have loved this contemporary evidence for development, but historically he saw that the state was not needed, that there was private provision, spontaneous order provision, and he said, my argument for vouchers is there as it were an expedient to move towards this purely private provision, rather than as he'd seen it before as an end in itself. So this is very interesting to your listeners, I'm sure.
Let's now focus on. Let's continue with another controversial issue, which is the state of government schools in advanced economies. It could be the UK or any other, really. Teachers and school administrators usually claim that they need more money to deliver higher standards. Do you think that is just the funding of state schools, or is something else that is going on there?
Well, I'm not an expert in this country, and I'll just say that straight forward. But I have, with colleagues, opened that low-cost private school up north, and there it's very, very clear we have a school that has satisfied all its Ofsted inspections, has glowing testimonials from parents and indeed the Ofsted inspectors.
Sorry, James, may I just say that Ofsted is the regulator of education
state
in the UK.
Inspector. And private schools have to be inspected either by the state inspector or by there's a separate private schools inspectorate doing roughly similar things, but there's compulsory, mandatory inspections. So we have all. So the school up north, at a fraction of the cost, 3/5 of the cost per capita funding in the state schools, it has satisfied the regulators that it is of good standard, and parents love it, and so it's very clear you don't need more money to do to do education properly, to educate properly.
So there's something else. There are other factors explaining that disparity.
And one is accountability,
ownership.
Yeah, but in and these are my words, but this is the impression I get when I talk to parents. So parents, for example, at the school up north, but or the schools all around the world that I've worked in, that they don't use this language, but they give the impression if they go to the state school, to the public school, as the international argument, they are like supplicants. They don't get to decide. They don't have any real power. All the power is taken away from them and given to the school and the administrators and the school board, and the rest of it. Whereas in a private school, it is the opposite, because you've got the right of exit. You can take your child away. The school margins are pretty tight in private schools, I've noticed. To my own.
So they will care.
Yeah, they care. They don't want to lose kids. So, but what do parents care about? Parents, as I mentioned earlier, care about a whole range of different things. Not, one parent isn't the same, but the private school, and typically, in a proper market, will cater for different needs and different requirements, and they care very much if their parent leaves. And the parent is much more in charge, and quite disconcertingly so when you sort of run schools, how the parents do feel they have the power, and they do. And they're the important people. I said as a chapter or bit in the book, The Beautiful Tree, the really important people are not researchers or outsiders like me who go and visit schools. No, the really important people are the parents. And they're the ones that the proprietors need to spend and prefer to spend time with.
James, say that you are put in an interesting position here in this country, so you are given the authority and the power to reform the educational system in the UK. Where would you start? How would you foster more competition in the system?
Well, listeners will be relieved to know that I shall never be granted this power because of my position. But I'm realistic enough to know I couldn't do this overnight. But the long-term aim, would be to disband the Department for Education, to defund the schools, and to allow a purely private, spontaneous order in education to emerge. And it would do so very, very successfully. My position is very, very clear. You don't need the state in education. You don't need the state in education for anyone, but particularly not for the poor. The poor manage very well on their own, thank you. And there's a tremendous self-help movement possible, which is being, there in many, many countries.
James, as you know, we have an excellent collection of books in the classical liberal tradition at the Vinson Centre here at the University of Buckingham, the Hayek Library, including books donated, a personal collection by E.G. West himself.
Yes.
For anyone interested in these topics, would you suggest a couple of his books or articles to start with?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest book, and it's not his best book, but it's the most accessible book, is Education and the State. It was published in 1965 by the Institute of Economic Affairs, reprinted in 1970-something, and then published as a Liberty Fund book in 1994 with an additional chapter about America. Education and the State is the place to start. His more careful and thorough book, which is a lot less accessible, is Education and the Industrial Revolution. Those would be the two books to read, and numerous articles. I mean, as you write to us, we can send articles, but we can send references. But he was a very, very careful economic historian, and has written some great stuff about the role of government in education.
Well, thank you, James, for joining us today. It's been a fascinating discussion about education.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you all very much for listening. This podcast is edited by the Vinson Centre at the University of Buckingham. You can visit our website at vinsoncentre.com to access our podcast series and know more about the programs and events we host, both in Buckingham and in London. Please subscribe to our newsletter if you want to receive timely information on the Vinson Centre's agenda.